Well, we are live for another week.
Yes, another Tuesday.
That's right, Wednesday in Japan.
Yes, Wednesday morning, early.
Well, good morning to you. I'm Mike Scala, and I'm joined by Jay Carter, also known as Timid, also known as Chair of BLM Tokyo, and several other good things. How are you?
Doing all right. And how about you, fighting the good fight there in New York as always?
Yes, that's exactly it. Staying busy. It's Tuesday again. I feel like we just did this, but that's a good sign. It means that I'm busy and working and can't complain.
Yeah. And we are joined, yes, a special guest this week. We have Sam Cook, Superwoman Extraordinaire from KMBA Creative Agency, right?
Yeah.
That's
KMBA,
okay.
yeah.
KMBA.
Yeah.
I knew I was going to mess that up.
Sounds like radio station call letters west of the Mississippi, because here we have W stations, right? But they start with a K. But you're from Australia, so that's not familiar to you at all, probably.
Probably not, but I am on the left coast these days in LA, so I better get to learning pretty quickly.
That's right.
Yeah, so we're going to get into what Sam's doing and what she's done. Got a very interesting history, and yeah, I think it's something good to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah. But first, why don't we get schooled, Jay?
Yes. Well, we got MIT and Lupe Fiasco, which you probably would not have thought something was going to happen, but I guess it's not that unheard of. So Lupe Fiasco posted up that he's going to be teaching rap at MIT. He's been holding on to this for a while, and I guess he's going to explain a little bit more in detail later. But he's going to be doing something with the MIT Arts Department where he's going to be teaching rap at the school.
I like it. And, you might not expect that necessarily, but as far as rappers go, I think he's a good choice to lead a class. Now, MIT is a very prestigious school, and that's a technology school. So that's also a bit of an interesting choice. It's not like NYU or a school where you would expect more of a strong liberal arts program. This is more technical. So I wonder if that's going to play into it as well. Is it going to teach rap from a scientific standpoint, or what is his approach going to be to these particular students?
Well, I think he's been in the code cipher. That was one of his big kind of pushes around computer science and rap. And I feel like it's a really smart and clever move. I feel like the bridge of technology and the arts has always been sort of separated out. But if you look at the fundamental core of even musicianship, you're talking about mathematics often in terms of rhymes and measures and timing. So yeah, more power to MIT for that. It's a very, very bold and clever move. I hope it continues to build other curriculums around the country.
I love it. And some people might not know because I do practice law, but before law school, my undergraduate degree was in computer science. And I've always saw that connection. See, some people who study science don't relate to the arts and music because they say that they're left-brained, right? They're usually the right-handed people. They're left-brained. I'm a lefty, so I'm right-brained, but I have that inclination to be more artistic, but I'm also good at math and science. So I do both, but a lot of people have a separation there. So I think it's good to teach people who are studying to be scientists or studying sciences or math more artistic skills as well.
Absolutely. And this is not entirely something that's out of left field. So he participated in a residency program with them where he shared insights about his entrepreneurship and his community advocacy and these types of things. And there have been other artists, and Nas has participated in teaching at some schools and those type of things. And I believe it was was it UCLA has a class on Tupac and his rhymes and
I think it's Berkeley, isn't it?
The Berkeley?
Berkeley. UCLA have just launched a big commitment to the Crip Hop movement for the disability artists in the rap scene, which is phenomenal. So they now have a PhD candidate. It's one of the co-founders up at UCLA. So there's, I think there's more acceptance now that contemporary forms in all its expressions are valuable in academic settings, for sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Speaking
I
of
mean,
Nas has that master class, which I want to check out. I saw a little bit of it, and he had some tips on his little preview video that he posted where he was talking about when you're writing a rhyme, it's helpful to him at least to write several different rhymes and then pick the best lines from each version and put together a master version of the rhyme. I would really be interested to watch that entire class because personally, he's my favorite MC, but I think he's certainly qualified as much as anyone to teach a class on putting together a rhyme and really approaching it from an academic point of view. I really enjoy that, because I have come from academics. I've got advanced degrees, but I also come from hip hop. So the marriage of the two is something that always interests me.
Yeah, and it's bringing culture to the front and center of the academic realm as well, and just marrying everything up because culture is all inclusive. And if you go back, before hip hop movements, you're talking about spoken word, and you're talking about all sorts of cultural nods to African diaspora and Africa and other parts of the world as well. So I think it's great to see shifts in that space for sure.
Absolutely.
and we need it. It's needed. I think we need to have more arts taught. We can't just keep cutting arts out. It's a valuable part of our society, and a personal and interpersonal development is to have connections to arts in some way, shape, or form.
It's part of what makes somebody a well-rounded person. I actually saw an interview that Kevin O'Leary from Shark Tank did with the Breakfast Club. And he said that the people he likes to hire in his businesses are people who are not the traditional workaholics, not people who spend 24/7 on their business, but people who have a strong art background. So they do their business, but they also maybe play the guitar or play drums or rap or whatever it is. He said that's the balance that you need. And it kind of sparks that genius that you need, even in business. Like they're really more related than people think. It's the yin and the yang. It really balances you out. And I think it makes you more effective, more productive at both somehow. I mean, some people will look at that like, you got to pick one lane or the other. But no, I think you really want to be a well-rounded, balanced person. And that does make you more successful with whatever you do.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I think so too. And it's also just good fun.
You need that in life, right? Especially in a time like this. With so much going on in the world, we saw right before we were about to come on news of another shooting. We just talked about the Buffalo one last time. Now in Texas is happening, and I believe this was an 18-year-old, they said, allegedly.
Right.
And they're saying that he was deceased. I guess he was shot by the police who arrived at the scene.
That's the details haven't been fully fleshed out at this time, but so it was an 18-year-old that went into this elementary school and killed 15 people, 14 students, one teacher, and I think at least 2 police officers were shot. And they suspect that it was the police officers that eventually took him down. So this is just developing actually right now, pretty much.
Now, today was also primary day for Texas, was it not? So people were voting in that school that day, we think, right?
I don't know. I didn't know. These were, as far as I know, the victims were children, aside from the teacher.
Okay. So this is looked at more, I guess, like a traditional school, not traditional, but like a school shooting more than a political shooting, right?
That's the thing. Traditional is unfortunately, it could be an adequate word with what's happening in the States. You were going to say something there, Sam?
Oh, just that, coming from the perspective again of Australia, I just keep repeating gun reform. There's so much to learn about how you can live without the excessive force or this notion of the right to bear arms in a very holistic society where there is more respect for one another. I get that it's a difficult proposition because, for many people, they feel like they're sort of lost in the source of this. And how many more shootings does America need to have? The way in which it's desensitized in society for me was alarming. To see, this kind of mass casualty kits in your Walmart kind of returns area, or insurance for mass shootings on billboards at in front of schools and things like that. I just go, okay, the world actually lives differently than this, and it would be really phenomenal to minimize the gun lobbyists in this conversation and bring forward some really sound policy, but really effective on the ground processes that aren't heavy-handed, that aren't looking at penalizing people of color at the baseline of this to make them look like the evil perpetrators. It's a complex space, but it's not one that can't move forward for the safety of everyone. Nobody wants their children to go to school one day and not come back, or their mum or their grandparents to be at the store buying birthday presents or groceries and not come back. That's kind of where the line in the sand really is, in my observation.
And
I think it's talk about this because you're the perfect guest to have this week.
I was going to say it. I know what you're going to say.
Right, because we actually mentioned on a prior episode what happened in Australia. And of course, you can speak about that, which with much more authority than we can. In the US, every single time this happens, the response is T's and P's, right? Thoughts and prayers. And it never goes beyond that. And it's the same thing. I wrote an article on common sense gun regulation back in 2012. I think I was talking about Sandy Hook at the time. And every time something like this happens, I just reshare my same article because it's still relevant, but nothing is really moving on this. And you did mention the right to bear arms. People in the US do hold that very dear. In Australia, obviously the culture is different, but my understanding is people were pretty much voluntarily saying, look, we have to stop this. We'll give up the guns if we need to, but we just don't want more people to be killed, right? Can you talk more about what happened in Australia?
Yeah, so what really happened was something called the Port Arthur Massacre in Tasmania, where an individual gunned down a significant number of people who were at a holiday destination spot. That really triggered a national response to whereby the government stepped in and they called for an amnesty for the receipt of weaponry to be provided at a depot, and then it was all disposed of. So the guns were taken out of society. The policies and restrictions around gun reform became very affirmed in a way that protected the citizens of Australia. And, that has for the most part been hugely successful. And I say for the most part because Australia does have a tendency to want to emulate what happens in the United States, but it's not at the level of what happens in the United States. And so from time to time there is gun violence, but the biggest issues in Australia at the moment, as in many parts of the world, is non-gun violence, in and around domestic violence, for example, or what they call the one punch rule, where people are violently assaulted physically. It's proven to work in countries not only exclusive to Australia, where you don't have to sort of fear walking out your door or even just being in your house, your own personal safety. And I think that is a big one in terms of the obstacle in the mindset of people. If you take my one weaponry or weapon of choice away, then what do I have? And so it's about a 360 approach. I feel it's about the conversation with community. It's about the conversation with those who, really uphold their right in the Constitution to bear their arms. But it's also looking at the services that wrap around these situations. What is there adequate mental health services being provided in communities? Often you'll find at the kind of backstory that there could be a mental health crisis involved, or the kind of rights around minimizing race-based hate organizations. What is being done to eradicate that pain point in the whole situation? Because this is, when you start talking about just stats and numbers and figures, and it's another one and there's 14, you actually lose the humanness of what just went on. People are, going home without their children today. And that's something that we should all feel deeply. Me personally, I feel deeply of all of the families that are in this situation, because even though it hasn't happened to us, it has happened to everyone collectively as a society.
Right. And I think, this is, like you said, people are going home without their children. The teacher, the teacher who passed, their family is going to be missing that person as well. And I think, Australia had the shooting, and the government moved to action, the society moved to action and said, you know what, we don't want any more of this. And we've had multiple cases of this. I remember, Columbine was this anomaly and now we're having Columbine, like,
Yeah.
very often, I think it's kind of something that it's you would think it would be unfathomable, right? That children should be learning active shooter drills, that children you should be worried about being shot at school by a mass shooter, that parents would be okay with this. We're the United States. Our promotional literature says we're the best of the best. We're supposed to be the beacon on the hill, right? Like, how do we allow this to go on? How do we allow their leaders to not do something about this, right? And this is all of their issue to deal with. And we need to, I think we need to be very, very specific as well. Like, we know there's one side that is very obstructionist in this regard. It's the GOP, Republicans, conservatives. Of course, all politicians
NRA.
have a part to play. The NRA, right? And they need to be dealt with at every turn, at every campaign stop, at every interview. This needs to be in their face. Like, deal with this. This shouldn't be a partisan issue. Like, you shouldn't, when those kids are being shot, they're children of conservatives and Republicans. They're children of the country, of the society. They're just children in general as well. It makes absolutely no sense. And I think, so the politicians and the parties, especially the GOP, are at fault in this regard, as far as the inaction on it, not to take away the personal responsibility of the shooters and the people who do this and the people around them. But also, I think the voters also have to get on it and stop re-electing people who are not moving on this issue, right? If you're not going to do something about this, get out of the way. And that, I think, it needs to be taken very seriously.
And you could do something about guns and still respect the Constitution. In fact, the words well-regulated are in the text of the Second Amendment. So the Second Amendment itself calls for regulation. And that's what we're saying. We're not saying, or at least I'm not, I don't think most people are saying, let's abolish the Second Amendment. I know some people say that, but that's not really the prevailing view on that. We're saying we can respect the right to bear arms, but do it in a much more responsible way.
See, I think that's what is probably confusing to a lot of people around the world. And I'm with you on that as well. Not calling for this abolishment of guns. There is kind of something, and it's probably a little bit of a strange thing, but in the US, as I think you said, like, we have this idea of, this right to bear arms, and this idea of having gun ownership that is kind of sacred, whether it's a Sikh sort of sacredness or whatnot, it is there. So no one has ever really called seriously any serious movement for the abolishment of guns and taking away all guns from people. It's just, let's do some common sense measures to stop children being slaughtered when they're trying to learn their ABCs. Just
right. And I wanted to ask you, Sam, how that has played out in Australia, because here in the States, what we hear often, I'm sure you hear it now, being in California, they say that if you take the guns away, it's not going to matter because people then will have massacres with knives and swords and forks. I mean, is that happening in Australia, or do the guns really matter?
There's no massacres with knives and forks. People are, I think there's always an extreme view to sensationalize trauma, and this is a very traumatic situation and circumstance, and so that is not an accurate description of what goes on in the world. There's probably more of a prevalence of that when you start to look at the data, because there is no real gun data in terms of the victims, or it would be nominal at best. But I feel, it's always a difficulty when the extreme of both sides, sensationalize a situation such as this for their own agendas. And it's about, as we've been talking about, it's about a bipartisan approach. It's about that this is not a political football to punt back and forth over a goal. This is actually real people in real lives, and it should not be left to the victims to advocate for this space. It should be society advocating for this space as a whole, and not just lobbyists advocating and being the most influential in this space either. So as Jalen said, it's the common sense approach I feel that we're all talking about today.
Right. And just to kind of put some of that in perspective, this shooting was in, I believe it's pronounced Uvalde, Texas. And so far this year, you know, we've had in the United States, there have been more than 200 mass shootings with more than 230 people dead and 840 injured. I mean, it's just like at some point, it's unthinkable that someone in positions to affect things would just like be like, oh, okay, that's just normal, that's okay. I don't
At what
get it.
point do we say enough's enough, or do we?
I think
Well,
we've passed that point.
Yeah, I think it's revising this acceptable death ratio that governments seem to be playing with the numbers, that it's okay for X amount of individuals to be deceased by gun violence, by massacres, by mass shootings. Draw that down to nil, make that a nil acceptable death ratio, because I know that there's somewhere in government who are saying, well, it's not as bad as 500,
Right.
but one should be bad as 500. We really need to kind of repeal some of that thinking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I want to talk about the poll that we did last week, because believe it or not, it was kind of on the same topic. We were talking about what should the government be doing or not doing to stop this or prevent this, what measures should be taken. And the poll we threw out was about the New York governor's idea for law enforcement and government to do more to monitor social media activities, to try to identify problem areas, maybe find people who might be thinking of doing something like this and crack down on it before it happens. So we asked our viewers and our listeners, did they think that was a good idea? Should the government do more to scrutinize social media? And on my poll, I found the results very interesting, because once again, my poll was split down the middle, 50-50, and I was watching it as it was going back and forth. I actually saw this breakdown by certain demographics, which I can get into, but why don't you give me your results first, Jay?
Well, for me, the results I had were 2-1 no, that government shouldn't be, monitoring much more stricter, the social media and whatnot.
Okay.
So again, and I think it's fair to say that it kind of also is it was kind of an open question. It was kind of a somewhat ambiguous question, because should they be doing more doesn't really say specifically what they're talking about doing. And so I think answers could also vary depending on what you're talking about specifically in that regard.
Right. But what I found interesting is this really broke down into groups where women and progressives said, yes, do more. Men and conservatives were saying, no, it's an overreach.
Wow. That kind of, well, let's see here. We've got, I think no, depending on what it is. I think last week we talked, Mike was also, you were either on the fence or you thought no?
No, I don't. I'm leaning more no. I think that there's a problem constitutionally when it comes to government intruding in our personal space. And I think, like we said, on other issues, it could lead to the slippery slope where people are scrutinized and kind of swept in who shouldn't be. I mean, it reminds me of things like the Patriot Act back in the day, and wiretapping. And there's a question of at what point does it become a violation of your Fourth Amendment right of an unreasonable search or seizure. So that's a major concern of mine. But I agree with what you were saying, that when we talk about doing more, what do we mean by more? More scrutiny of individual people? Maybe not. More of an effort generally? Yes. But what does that look like, right?
Exactly.
I mentioned law enforcement, for example, locally here in Queens. They will, and I'm sure this happens around the country, they'll put out post on social media and I'll say such and such crime happened. If you have any tips, let us know. Contact us through social media, through our Facebook page. And the precincts will be very active sometimes on these neighborhood groups on Facebook. And I think that's fine. I don't think we should be saying law enforcement and government has to be off of social media. But I think that there is a careful line we have to draw when it comes to them scrutinizing individual people's activities.
Right.
And I was going to say, specificity is absolutely paramount in this conversation. It's interesting you broke down the demographics about the women and the men. I feel that behind all of this is some work that needs to be done around the bias in algorithms and some of the data that they do collect, because doesn't accurately capture the ability to really police in the way that you need to. And that's, there's organizations that are moving to address this, but under-resourcing that piece, for example. Google comes to mind just as one. How do we get in front of this? Is to recognize that the government already has a place in our lives. The moment we're issued a social security number, we have our name on record, and in many other ways we engage in that space. When it becomes an overreach, obviously, is that sense that you're being within a police state environment and you can't just conduct your life accordingly, and that becomes problematic. So I think it is more deep diving in terms of the question, perhaps, so that there is more action taken at structural level in terms of what that looks like, in the way in which the social media platforms are enablers and also potential perpetrators of continuing to perpetuate that information out into communities. And there was an attempt very late in the piece with the previous administration around the misinformation campaigns that were happening, but left for a very long time to manifest itself not only in the United States but around the world, because that absolutely jumped continents, and people were saying the same misinformation and rhetoric, but just framing it to their local situations. And so how does the social media world sit within this space in an honest and fair and equitable way for all, so that we're not penalizing the wrong people necessarily, or not addressing the bias that sits behind the information itself.
Right. And I think there's a difference between this idea of Big Brother is watching, which is what a lot of people are opposed to, and law enforcement acting on tips. And look, if someone tips law enforcement that someone looks like they're saying something that's a little crazy, they can take a look based on the tip, but they don't have to respond to that. If it's just someone who's saying something a little nutty, it's one thing. But if it looks like they may actually be on the verge of doing something serious, maybe that does warrant further investigation. So it doesn't mean they have to be actively watching everyone, but they just need to be smart in what they're responding to and uphold the law, right? Which includes people's constitutional rights.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that kind of also brings an issue, a potential, like, do they wait for tips, or do they have some sort of monitoring algorithm, like some of these data companies that monitor all the tweets and all the social media chatter that go out for and look for certain keywords, or just suck in all that data and have an algorithm sorted out so they can look at people and monitor people like that? Like, do you monitor people as if they're already under investigation, or do you wait for tips to come in? I think that's, something that also needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely. It's always that balancing act, right, between respecting individual liberties and looking out for the public interest and public safety. And I think we do need to do both in a way that, furthers that interest of keeping us safe, but that doesn't trample constitutional rights. Because maybe this is an American thing again, but we do value our freedoms and our liberties here. And you know what? I'm sure some version of that exists around the world as well, right? Just the idea of, hey, we want to live our lives without you all in our business.
Absolutely. And you don't want to feel like you are in a police state. You want to feel like you can go about your day freely, not being almost profiled as if you were wrongdoing when you're just living life as best you can. So
absolutely. And yeah, because a lot of people get caught up in those things that shouldn't be caught up as well when those things happen. Communities get disproportionately affected as well.
Sure. And I actually think that leads to a more dangerous atmosphere when everyone feels like they're walking on eggshells all the time. They're always being scrutinized. They're always being watched. You just feel uneasy. And, it's just like a cornered animal, so to speak. Not saying that we're animals naturally, but we are animals, right? At the end of the day, we react when provoked, just like any other being would. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's definitely something to keep in mind. Now, before we go any further, I do want to get into Sam and what you do, and a lot of things that you do have been activism and arts promotion, and when I introduced you and Mike some years back, when you came to New York, you were actually going to the UN to tell them about themselves. I'd like to speak to you and your, what you're working on now and where you kind of come from.
Yeah, so I'm Aboriginal Australian, and I'm from a very sort of small nation up in the northwest of Western Australia, which, compared to living in Los Angeles is a completely counter reality. It's 28 families in a very small community, on the outskirts of a very small town, in a country whose population is smaller than the whole of the state of California. So, we're talking about kind of minute numbers, but I have been working in the arts for a very long time. I'd say I was sort of born into it because I take more of a cultural standpoint on the arts, not being othered. And so it sort of infiltrates, as Mike said, left-handed, left and right brain kind of functioning together to bring a kind of even sensibility about it. But when there are injustices that are happening, especially within Australia, within the Aboriginal space, I tend to stand up and hold space for other people to come forward. And, often that may be to counter violence from the government, as what happened in 2015 when I mounted the SOS Black Australia campaign, or it could be in the form of just telling our story better, which is why I founded Australia's Black History. Aboriginal people in Australia, just to give context, are Black people. We took the C out of the BLACK and started to own our own lane in that space to start to reclaim more narrative around how, in a kind of pan-Indigenous space we wanted to be defined, but we also see ourselves in our tribal nationhood. So I would say I'm from the Nyikina Nation, for example. And so, founding Black History Month in Australia was really to start to honour that these narratives exist around the world, that there's a number of hidden figures in our stories that never are brought forward. And I was able to, have the honour of discovery and finding a lot of hidden figures in Australia's history that were Aboriginal people who had some of the most incredible acts of achievement that were unrecognised. So that's been a 14-year process of love so far. And it will continue. It's something that I'm just absolutely committed to. But in many respects, the kind of gravitational pull has been to arts. I've worked in publishing and theatre. I also then ended up into festivals and events. And so that's sort of where I'm at here in LA at the minute. And working on some really beautiful projects. One of them is to embed a festival into the LA County Fair with the view to kind of roll that out to the fairgrounds around the world, but also have space for independent artists who are often on the outer of a big kind of monopoly of, two key players in the industry nationally, for example. Where do they get their kind of early entry starting point? And so identifying that there is an opportunity through, a ready-made audience. It just happens to be the 100th anniversary of the LA County Fair. And also to see that a lot of the major festivals in the world tend to bring a fair to them. So we thought, why don't we bring the festival back to the fair? We've had 200 artists involved. We're in our last week coming up. And then once that concludes, I'm working on the launch of the 6th Street Viaduct, the 6th Street Bridge in downtown Los Angeles as it reopens. And that was one that you would, I would say it's probably the most credited bridge, the former 6th Street Bridge. It's been in everything from Grease to the Terminator to, Madonna's Borderline video, showing my age. But it's finding myself at the seat of the history of Los Angeles in 2022, which I'm finding really fascinating, to be able to bring the Tongva Nation, the Indigenous owners here, their story forward in these processes as well, is something as an Indigenous Australian I've committed to, so that we don't lose the agency of the people of Turtle Island. it's been a really exciting time to be here, but it's also been a very challenging time, as we all know, because of global pandemics and new systems in place and a lot of conflict abroad, and just that dynamic of how do you all re-emerge outside on the other end of a pandemic. So they're some of the kind of key things I've been up to as of late.
Always into a lot of things going on there. And I mean, you said you had a bunch of artists that came out, and you got two artists right here. I don't recall getting an invite. Did you, Mike?
Might have got lost in the mail. I'll have to check again when I get back later.
Yeah, must have
It's
been
coming.
So yeah, and I think with also I thought was pretty amazing about you, like you moved from Australia to LA, and then you just kind of hit the ground running, and just got into the mix of things, and able to do extend the work that you were doing in Australia in California, as well as get into some other new things as well.
Yeah. And I think, I probably mentioned this before, but I have a 200-year plan. So, how do I get going? It's obvious, I hit the ground running on everything, because I'm not going to be here in 200 years, but hopefully some of the, the seeds I've planted in the concrete will grow, and, the world will be just that little bit better.
The 200-year plan. I'm going to start asking people I'm interviewing for jobs. So where do you see yourself in 200 years?
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to look at it. It talks about, it kind of implies like your intention to leave some sort of a legacy, instead of like, what's your 5-year plan? What is it you're going to do for you? It's like, what are you going to do for the world? So with
It's true, because a lot of people will say, I don't know, I won't even be here. My kids won't be here. My grandkids will be here. What do I care? But we should start framing the conversation that way, so people do start thinking long term, and not just 200 years, but let's start with more than what's right in front of their face, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It alters everything. You all of a sudden are a little bit more mindful of sweating the small stuff, for example. You're always looking kind of above the horizon. You're always like, how can I be a bit better as a human to everybody else? And how do I sort of leave a legacy? But, if you ask someone, do you even want to be remembered in 200 years? A lot of people may not even have the answer to that question. I hope that not necessarily if I personally am not remembered, but the change that I was able to kind of enact in my tenure on the world stage will be present in 200 years, or at least the knowledge of people doing better or trying to do better for a bigger picture. Yeah, so that's why I do it.
And then I think I love that point, actually. I'm probably going to steal it from you and tell others, okay, but I'll give you credit. And I think one thing you mentioned when you're talking about standing up for Indigenous Australians and for the history and the things that they weren't recognized for and whatnot. I remember reading at one point, and I found it incredibly amazing that we talk about like the Romans and the Egyptians and the Macedonians and this and that, and we neglect that the Aboriginal Australians have had community continuously for at least 65,000 years.
Yeah.
And we don't mention that ever. At least 65,000 years, at least, right? Isn't there evidence that goes even beyond that? But
it does. And, our ancestors and elders said from the beginning of time, and it's a sophisticated system, but in the way in which we're framed globally, with the savage or the kind of borderline animal, because Australia did categorize us as animals up until the late 60s, early 70s. So there's a lot of, I guess, misinformation out there, or just, if you ask someone on the street, what do you think about Aboriginal people in Australia? Most times they'll say we don't, because everyone's got local pressing issues, just maintaining their being in society at this point in time, that they don't have the luxury of knowing about others in the world. So by being able to tell a really pure story that there is an amazing legacy, that it was 800 nations, and it is 800 nations, a very sophisticated culture, that there's a lot of pride in this knowledge, and there's a lot to give and share to the world because of having that insight, is a really kind of valuable platform that I don't take lightly either.
Yeah, I think it's amazing.
It's like in the US, people don't think about Native Americans much.
No.
Yeah, it's almost, and that's what confronted me when I got here, was the erasure of the First Nations story here. And it's almost as if gentrification has taken the seat in front of it. And I'm like, but if you drill through gentrification, it's somebody's land, and the land is, you know, the nations of Turtle Island. And so I always proactively seek out the community to make sure that they know that I'm here to be respectful, that I'm here to hold space as I navigate through their land. And, you know, we have great relationships because of that, because I'll make sure that there's a land acknowledgement in everything from the document I send to the council, or when I'm, you know, having these conversations with people at a you know, level of influence, or I'll ask an elder to participate and do a welcome to country, which is something we do pretty actively in Australia. But seeing, you know, local elders here doing it for the first time and feeling recognised and seen is a really beautiful progression in the story of the erasure of people here, you know, whose country we stand and inhabit.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking of the Native Americans, there's the whole genocide of the Native Americans that happened, that is never talked about. I'm not even talking about Trail of Tears type of stuff. I'm talking before that were millions were just wiped out, that never gets talked about, not even in history class. So yeah, I mean, when you say erasure, like you're spot on with how that whole thing goes. And I think what one of the reasons bringing that up is the continuous legacy and history and culture of the Aboriginal people, is that, you know, we are 200 plus years in our culture in the United States. This Western culture, we're talking about 2,000, 3,000 plus years. And we're at a point in society, at least in the States after 200 years, where we're looking at this massive crunch of society, where we're going the way we're going. We're probably not going to be able to make it another 200 years. Some things have to change. However, the Aboriginal culture was able to do 60,000 years, 65,000 years at least, and still maintain culture and society. And so I think there are lessons that can be learned. Of course, these are different times, but there are definitely lessons that should be learned from that, because there was a successful society in that regard that we need to take, you know, today.
Yeah, and I'll say that the Aboriginal community is waiting for that conversation. You know, often it's their intellectual property, our intellectual property is attributed when someone feels like that they've discovered it. But it's been common or knowledge within our tribal nations for a very long time. And that's, you know, First Nations around the world. We step differently, and we step in a way that is really mindful of our place in the greater story. And what that looks like is really important now in climate change, in the way social structures are, in the disconnect or the elective of culture, remove it as a fundamental core of society. There's so many different kind of planes that our knowledge and our sharing of that knowledge and our advocacy of that knowledge moving forward is critical. But also, you know, there's just the legacy that we're building through in terms of what post-colonial stories we're able to kind of push through in, you know, a lot of misinformation of history, for example.
Right.
I want to shout out some of the viewers in the chat: Joanne, James, Megan, Dennis, Pat. I know some of you are tuning in because you're waiting for us to dump on Bill de Blasio. We will get there, but we have some other topics to cover.
And so on just a segue from what we were just talking about, as far as being able to have a lasting culture and a lasting society, there was an article that came out recently where Oxfam International put out a statistic that said that during the pandemic, a new billionaire was created every 30 hours. And that as a result of that, there are going to be millions of people who are going to be affected with extreme poverty because of this massive hoarding of wealth. And Oxfam's, what they called it, profiting from pain. And they proposed there be a 2% wealth tax on millionaires, a yearly wealth tax on millionaires, and a 5% yearly wealth tax on billionaires, which would raise about $2 trillion per year to, be able to be used for things like healthcare or what have you. So, what do you think about something in that regard?
I think we can start with trying to close loopholes and make sure that people pay their income tax, because if people pay the taxes they were supposed to pay now, we will be able to raise a lot of this money. And that's really an issue. So before we try to circumvent that, say, well, they're not paying enough taxes, let's try to create this other tax. Well, who's to say they would pay that one? I mean, they're probably going to find a way around that one as well. So I think we should start by getting the tax revenues that we are supposed to be receiving, and we're not.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I second and third that, Mike.
And I bring it up because, as a society going forward with this huge inequality in wealth and this huge inequality in distribution of resources and whatnot, we won't be sustainable. We can't last. We're not going to last 16,000 years, with, new billionaires being minted at 30, every 30 hours. It's not going to happen. So we have to find some way to address this. And I agree with you, Mike, that let's close some of these loopholes so these taxes are paid so we get that revenue that is supposed to be coming in anyway.
I mean, how is it that Elon Musk doesn't pay taxes? Just borrowing money off of his assets and circumventing the intention of having income tax, right?
Right. Yeah. And even Warren Buffett has said he pays less taxes than people that work for him.
Right.
And I think people don't realize in that regard is like a lot of it is also off of investment. So it's a lot of these guys, he's an investor, and investment income is taxed at capital gains rate, which is 15%. Whereas the regular working people, their tax is usually 24, 25%, business tax may be something different, but if they're getting their income from their capital gains, they're going to be paying a smaller rate than the average worker at a fast food joint.
I think the distinction also was if you have an asset for more than a year. I remember I don't do much stocks, but I had some stocks, and I remember that if I held on to them, I believe it was for a year. If I held on to them for more than a year, the profits would be capital gains, not regular income, right?
Absolutely. If you buy a stock and you sell it within a year, then you're going to be taxed at your regular income rate. But if you sell it after a year, then it goes to the capital gains rate, which goes down to 15%. Yeah.
So obviously people will do that, right? They'll hold on to their assets for a while to avoid that higher tax rate.
Sure.
Or if you've just bought crypto and you've been watching that market, you might want to hold on to it for a lot longer right now.
You definitely have to hold on to it because everybody is in the toilet right now. And that's retail investors as well as institutions. Nobody is in the green on crypto or actually stocks too. The whole stock market is in the toilet right now. It's generally everywhere is down. Even in real estate, like everywhere's down right now.
And the interest rates are going up in real estate.
Right. And this is more than likely, part of this is going to be a result of, the stimulus stuff that went out, all the other free money that went out. Like it has to be paid back in some way. But this is just kind of an extreme kind of example right off the bat.
Almost burst, right?
Yeah. So
shout out to Madeline, who's tuned in. So Jay, why don't we pose the poll question then? It was going to be based off this topic, right?
Right. Okay. So poll question for this week: should there be a yearly wealth tax on millionaires and billionaires?
Fair enough. We'll see what people say.
Yeah.
So I wanted to get to, I guess, another update on what's happening in New York. Obviously, this is a redistricting year, and every week I've been giving updates on what's happening. We had a lawsuit, actually a series of lawsuits that ended up with our entire districts in New York being thrown out and ruled unconstitutional, and a court had to redraw them. And you have some weird and wacky results in some cases. I mentioned last week there was a ruling that if you had petitioned previously and you made the ballot under a district that is now thrown out, gone, the court had said that you were allowed to just declare for a new seat. And I questioned last week if this would lead to people from one place saying, you know what, I don't like the competition, I don't like the way it's looking where I live, where I petitioned originally, so now I'm going to use this court decision to declare myself at the ballot in a completely different place. That's actually happened. And we saw a congressman named Mondaire Jones, who was recently elected for the first time, didn't like the way the field was shaping up in his district. Really, now, to be clear, his district was also thrown out. Everyone's district was thrown out. So the lines are all different now. But in his area, right, where you would think he would run, where he lives, he didn't like the way that was looking because he had very stiff competition there. So this guy who was from north of New York City, Westchester County, is saying he's going to run now in a district in the city, which is a newly created district that's considered an open seat because there's no real incumbent who has much of that area. So he's in there now. Kind of weird. To me, it looks like a little bit like a fish out of water. He's not from there. He's not from the city. And he's declaring himself a candidate, having petitioned in a different area altogether, just saying, you know what, I'm going to use this to put my name on a ballot in New York City for Congress. He's allowed to do it. And constitutionally, you are allowed, because if you live anywhere in the state, you can run in any district. So you don't have to live in your district to run for Congress. For Senate, similar things are happening, the state Senate, because in a redistricting year in New York, you only have to live in the county of your district, not in your actual district. And so you do have people from other places. Now they're still running in their counties, but they're running outside their neighborhoods. So a lot of weird stuff happening there. But I wanted to focus on this 10th congressional district, the one that I mentioned, Mondaire Jones running in, because the former mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, is also running in this. And he's really taken up all of the oxygen in the room because everyone's talking about the former mayor now running for this. It does contain his area where he's from, Park Slope, Brooklyn, and he's arguing that that's his base. We're going to see if it's still intact. I mean, he was a city council member there a long time ago, obviously since became the mayor. And when you become the mayor of New York City, the perception of you changes, even in your home area. People start looking at you different. Historically, it's been a roadblock. A lot of people have been mayor of New York City and tried to run for higher office or tried to run for another office and failed. And I just pulled the stats on this. The last time it happened successfully, let's see, in 1869, you had a mayor, John T. Hoffman, who won his bid for governor. So that was the last time a mayor of New York City ran for higher office. But then in 1913, you had someone named Adolph Klein, who was briefly mayor, and he ran for Congress, which I guess is seen as a lateral move or maybe even a step down, considering a New York City mayor is so big, it's the biggest city in the country, versus Congress, which has a smaller constituency. But nonetheless, it is going from mayor to a federal seat. So that's a move some people try to make. Nonetheless, early 1900s, last time it was successful. The mayor of New York City really has been a roadblock for people. I think because there's just so much heat on you. It's just such a difficult job. It's probably the most thankless job there is. And you're going to anger a lot of people. I mean, it's maybe a similar effect when you have New York City council speakers trying to run for mayor. But they always think that they're in such a great position because it's such a prominent spot. But by the time they actually start running for mayor, they find out they've made too many enemies. So I find that to be an interesting thing. People are talking about Bill de Blasio like he might be the front runner, which is scary to a lot of people because he was not a very popular mayor by many measures, but he does have the name recognition. Like I said, it was his prior base. He has the ability to raise money. And so you do have to take him seriously. I wanted to mention, this is a very crowded field though, so we'll see how it plays out. There is a former congresswoman who's 80 years old now named Elizabeth Holtzman. She was part of the Judiciary Committee in the House when they voted to impeach Nixon. And of course, he resigned before being impeached, but she voted to impeach and she was part of that process. She's considering a comeback at 80 years old, citing the Roe v. Wade reversal that's upcoming, saying that we need to fight her for women's rights. So I'm watching this very intently to see how it plays out. I don't know who I'm going to support in this. Not a great fan of Bill de Blasio because I don't think he was great as an administrator. I think he really dropped the ball when it came to focusing on the outer boroughs, focusing on the Rockaways and Queens. He talked about how he was going to be a mayor for the outer boroughs, and I really do think he failed in that regard. So I would not be supporting him for that seat. It's also not my district, to be fair, but it may be the most exciting race happening in New York City right now.
Yeah, and it's been speculation for weeks on, will he or won't he actually, get into a race, even though he was putting out ads and whatnot. So I guess he's decided he's going for a congressional seat at this point.
I think you might be talking about Andrew Cuomo. He had the ads.
Cuomo. Sorry, yes, I was thinking
Yeah.
Cuomo. Yeah,
But de Blasio, was
right.
thinking of running for governor at one point.
Right.
And he backed out of that. He was also thinking of running for a different congressional seat, and he backed out. But that was before they were redrawn again. So yeah, he has made up his mind. He's going to be in this. Now he would have to petition because he didn't run in the initial round, right? When people made the ballot and they changed the district.
Right.
He wasn't even involved in that. So he has to start from scratch.
Yeah.
Or a lot of other candidates like Mondaire Jones, the current congressman from Westchester, who they're just given a seat now. So they might as well. I mean, even if someone doesn't think that they have a great shot, I mean, they already petitioned, they already raised the money, they've already qualified for the ballot. They might as well just say, hey, I'm going to throw my hat into this ring and see what happens, because what do you got to lose at that point?
Yeah, go ahead, let's all throw our hats in the ring. I guess
If I had petitioned previously for some seat, yeah, I would be doing the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Does that then split the vote and just conflate the whole process?
Right, and that's something to keep in mind as well. New York City just went to ranked choice voting, but that does not apply to federal elections, and it does not apply to state elections. It applies to municipal elections. So people running for mayor, yes. City council, yes. But Congress, no. So yes, the idea of splitting a vote is very important to consider, because you're going to have several candidates in that race in particular fighting for the progressive lane. Even Holtzman, she came up as what you would consider a progressive, but a long time ago in the 70s, right? So what is that going to look like for her now? Is she still going to be able to have some of that base of today's voters? That remains to be seen. De Blasio, I think, also thinks he's going to get that progressive vote, but these new voters in Park Slope, where he's from, they may go for one of the newer candidates, but like I said, since he became mayor, he's not looked at in the same light. He's not that shiny new toy. There's been a new generation since. And so I think a lot of these constituencies are going to be split up, and then you might have an opportunity for someone who comes in from a different lane who could take it, because you don't need a majority. When it's so crowded, somebody can win with 25% of the vote. So
yeah.
very interesting.
Yeah, it's going to be, a crowded field all the way around. So, wow. Well, we'll see what happens. Any news on whether Cuomo just has made a decision?
It doesn't look as though he's running, because petitioning has begun already to make the ballot as an independent, and there's really no life of him at this point. It doesn't mean that he can't, because he does have the resources to put it together quickly. But when you're talking about a statewide race, it is a very major operation. It's not really something you would recommend doing with 1 week left in the game. You really need to get on the ball. So at this point, it does not look like he will be part of the cycle.
Okay, wow. And you come from a political background as well, political family as well, right, Sam?
Didn't know we were touching on this. Yeah, my father was a federal senator in Australia for 23 years, and my mother was an Aboriginal activist. So I kind of got a bit of both of the special sauce in terms of my outlook. But yeah, Australia's just got a brand new prime minister. We've had the tyranny of the coalition, as it's called, who modelled themselves very heavily on former president of the United States of America. I'm trying to find words. In the most unhealthy...
Former White House occupant, this is what I would say.
Former White House occupant, and just espoused the same rhetoric, but changed, America, Australia, it still starts with A. So let's, make paraphernalia to mirror and emulate the United States experience again, while a really heavy interconnection between church and state playing out. He's an active member of Hillsong. So there were a lot of provisions, especially over COVID, that were in favour of his particular church in receipt of being able to have mass occupancies during a global pandemic. And I mean, he was a businessman who was appointed through a leadership spill. He wasn't necessarily appointed by the people, but the regime of Australia, I think generally people have woken up feeling a little bit lighter. I feel like that's very similar to waking up the next day in America after the previous presidential election, myself included. But then it's very quickly the reality that this is still a very steady, similar situation where things aren't going to change. Hope is not necessarily the commodity. It's the strategy of a two-party preferred environment versus, different models. And Australia is under the Westminster governance model, so they are slightly different in that respect, be it prime minister versus president, but it's the same elected official. So Australia has interesting times ahead because the policy adoption, especially around Aboriginal people, has been to adopt the previous government's policy and really push some of the rhetoric that was out there versus listening to what the consensus of Aboriginal people are after at the moment, which is the People's Treaty going to government to recognise that it is indeed an illegal occupation for the last 200 plus years, and that we're at the time now to mature. And, I guess one wish in my 200-year plan is for Australia to break away from the Commonwealth and the British model to be its own republic, because we are very asset rich. Our cultural lands are asset rich, and we have the ability to back an economy because of that. It's just the current models obviously don't allow it to come through in the way that it needs to.
Yeah. By the way, I wanted to clarify, I was very careful not to say upstate, because I know that in New York City, we sometimes jokingly, sometimes not jokingly, consider anything north of the Bronx to be upstate. Mondaire Jones was from Westchester and also Rockland County. These are counties immediately north of New York City. So I wanted to clarify that, but he is running in the city. So different district, different area altogether. But before anyone beat me up, Westchester and Rockland County is where Mondaire Jones was from, or represented.
New York as a state in general tends to focus more on New York City, where the rest of the state kind of gets forgotten. So
right, and also if you look at a map of New York, it's so big geographically speaking, but really the people are for the most part in New York City and then the New York City metro area, Long Island and Westchester County as well. But when you start going north and west into the state, it's really more land than people. It's vast openness.
And beautiful land.
Like that with much of the country though, right? Most of the country is like that. And that's why when you look at a map and they say, Trump famously did this, where he's like, look how red the map looks, because right. Most of the counties are more conservative, but they're also very spread out and not densely populated. Most right. of the people in the country are centered around really just a few population centers in major cities, and there really aren't that many.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, like I said, most people think New York City is New York entirety, and there's
what's funny?
Beautiful land, a lot of gorgeous land up there.
Yeah, I had a friend from out of state who asked me what I was doing once. I said I was going to the beach. And she was like, there are beaches in New York. Where is there room for a beach in New York with all the buildings?
Yeah, look, I love hearing about this, because I know, my experience in Lenape country is that it is so much broader once you step outside of the epicenter of what really the world views as one of the major cities globally. So getting into the kind of the peaceful spaces where you go, I'm still in New York. It's beautiful country up there.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And when I got a job working in the Senate in Albany, I got to go really north for the first time, because growing up in Queens, we went south, we went to Florida, or maybe DC. We drove south on the I-95 usually. I never went north. I never drove north through New York State until I got that job in the Senate, and I got to see really how beautiful of a state it is for the first time.
Yeah, yeah. We actually, when you came to New York that time, we all three of us, we went to the beach in Rockaway.
And that was my first time at the beach, and it gave great context. And I was like, wow, there is this whole other part of New York that I'm really curious and, really happy to have seen, and just to see people in place in their own areas, just living their best life and doing their day-to-day, which I really appreciated, because you often, if you're especially outside of the US, you come to New York, it's Manhattan.
Right.
And Times Square, I hate that. I mean, it's interesting, but I hate when tourists, but I shouldn't say tourists, I should say people I know. When people I know come to New York and they stay in Times Square and they act like that's the entire New York experience. Like, you know how many times in my life I've been there? Like, that's people who live here don't do that type of thing, you know?
Yeah. I agree. I think, you know, similar here in Hollywood, I try and avoid the kind of tourist traps because there's a really beautiful way that the cities reveal themselves once you step outside of the kind of the facade of it, if you will. So I really, I appreciate New York. I'm really hoping to see much more of it than I do. So, you know, constant traveler, the beaches were stunning.
Yes, and by the way, right now I'm sitting in Rockaway staring at the beach that we were at. Perfect view.
That is not fair, but I do have sunshine, so.
Yeah, but you're not too far from the beach yourself.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not that far. Everything's relative, and you know, there's some beautiful beaches over here as well. It's just the 2 hours in the traffic gridlock to get there at the moment, but pick your timing, and yeah, it's beautiful. I'm fascinated from coming from a very flat, big sky country to the actual mountainscapes and things over here as well. And surprisingly, a lot of the green space that is in LA that you wouldn't see if you were just in Hollywood.
Well, I think it's about time to wrap up before I'm completely engulfed by the shadow.
Yeah, it started out very bright, and now you can tell like it's the sun's gone down.
Sunset.
Yeah, you're basked in the warm glow of the orange of the Rockaway sunset.
This has been a joy, though. Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I appreciate you spending time talking.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you accepted and coming on. It's always good to talk with you. Always good to get your perspective and to hear you speak. So appreciate you taking the time out.
Yeah, and thanks to everyone who tuned in today.
Yes, and
absolutely. And that reminds us, Jay, why don't we do the plugs before we go?
Right, and for you to catch up on the show and previous episodes, we do have a YouTube channel where all of these episodes will be put up. It's Nuance with Mike Scala and Jay Carter, Nuance being the name of the show, because we want to spark nuanced conversations about various topics, which we think are kind of lost these days in a lot of the discourse. So hit us up on YouTube, subscribe, and I guess click the notification bell, as they say. Also, if you are more of a podcast person, the audio for the shows are also available in podcast form on iTunes, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere where podcasts can be downloaded. So yeah, definitely check us out. And then of course, every Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we are going to be live here.
Well, thank you all for tuning in. It's been another great week, and we'll catch you next time.